met Reverend Henslow.
My life goes on in endless song of waters.
I was out scouting those rebels. There were rebels behind us.
Hey, Angua, hey, Angua, hey, Angua, hey, Angua, hey, Angua, hey, Angua, Angua, Angua.
Time is a circle, not a line. The far distant past and the unknowable future are in this very moment intertwined. My great-great-great-grandma was Tsalagi. Cherokee, most people say, but in our language, it's Tsalagi. And my great-great-great-grandpa was Scots-Irish. Maybe you know, when England invaded Ireland and stole the land from the Irish lords, the Brits imported Scottish labor, like indentured servants, half a step above slavery. My father's family immigrated to this country before there was a United States of America. So both sides of my family were here before there was a country. Now, one thing you might know is most of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were Scottish or Irish with no love lost for the British. And his family, they weren't really thrilled that he was marrying this Indian woman. And her family, not excited that she was marrying this immigrant, this foreigner. And we saw the trail of broken treaties. We saw the trail of broken promises. And we knew where that trail was leading. So they just moved a little further west. Now, something left out of your history book is President Andrew Jackson won the White House in large part because of a battle he fought after the War of 1812 was over. This is not a trick question. In what year was the War of 1812 fought? In 1814, took a little trip, long Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi, took a little bacon and we took a little beans, fought the bloody British in the town of New Orleans. Well, we fired our guns and the British kept coming, weren't quite as many as it was a while ago. Fired once more and they began running down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Up, 2, 3, 4. Something else left out of your history book? Jackson won that battle in large part because of a Choctaw and a Tsalagi or Cherokee warrior fighting at his right and left hand. The British way of fighting is they would wear a red uniform with a white cartridge belt, almost like an X saying, shoot me here. And they would line up shoulder to shoulder, some of them on their knees, some of them standing up, some of them laying down. So even if you're a bad shot, you're going to hit one of them. The Tsalagi said, no, we're not going to march out onto a field and let them massacre us. There's more of them, and they have better guns. Let's lead them into the swamps. Let's get them lost. Jackson became known as a swamp fox because of a warrior known as Black Fox, who was his advisor. And not once but twice, both the Choctaw and the Tsalagi warrior literally threw themselves in harm's way, took a bullet to save Jackson's life. That's what you do for your commanding officer. And what kind of gratitude? How does he show his thanks? One of his first acts as president, in violation of a Supreme Court decision. Yeah, we saw it coming. So the Tsalagi, we sent our best and brightest to Harvard. They graduated cum laude, top of their class, as lawyers. They thought, if we're going to fight the white man in the white man's courts, we should study the white man's laws. And they won every court decision, from the local courts to the state to the federal to the United States Supreme Court, who decided, get this, ready? Brace yourself. The United States Supreme Court decided the United States of America should honor its own laws. What is a treaty? It's actually a federal law made with another country, another government. President Andrew Jackson, in violation of a Supreme Court decision, forcibly removed all tribes east of the Mississippi. Forced from our home in Carolina, all that we own stolen, burned, an order tacked upon a tree trunk. You're not welcome here, don't return. How many roads must we travel? How many rivers must we cross? How many ravens will escort us? How can we ever count the cost? How can we ever count the cost? One thing we can easily count: the number who died. More than 4,000 of my ancestors perished on this forced march, now romantically called the Trail of Tears. But my family, we saw it coming. So we just kept moving west to avoid that tragedy, denied our Indian heritage. My father's family settled in western Tennessee, eventually moving on to Illinois. Now, after the War of 1812, our nation was cash-strapped and land-rich, and we could not afford to pay our veterans. Isn't that still a problem, that we don't take care of our veterans? These men and now women who risk their lives for the freedoms our nation is built upon, and we can't afford to pay them or give them good health care? The veterans' homes, the veterans' hospitals. Well, after the War of 1812, when our nation was cash-strapped, we decided instead of paying them in cash, we'd give them land. Land that was illegally stolen in a treaty, but who's paying attention here? And so lots of the veterans of War of 1812 were giving land grants. And some of them didn't want to leave kith and kin in Kentucky, hearth and home in New Hampshire. And so they would sell their land grants to a speculator. And here's the most important question I'm going to ask. Who would like to buy something for 3 cents, knowing you can sell it for $3? You do the math. What's your profit margin? Now multiply that by thousands or tens of thousands of acres. Some speculators bought more than 100,000 acres for pennies on the dollar. And in order to sell it, they hired a songwriter to travel the Atlantic seaboard to sing the glories of Illinois. This was our unofficial state anthem before we were even a state. Way down upon the Wabash, such land was never known. If Adam had passed o'er it, he'd call the soil his own. He'd think it was the garden he played in as a boy. Straightway pronounce it Eden in the state of Illinois. So move your family westward, bring all your girls and boys, and cross at Shawnee Ferry in the land of Illinois. Actually, Abraham Lincoln's father, Thomas, he loved this song. Some say that's part of the reason why Abraham and his family moved here. As more and more Europeans came, my family just kept moving west. I remember in Illinois, in the early days, there were great flocks of birds that would darken the skies for days. John James Audubon once counted one flock of passenger pigeons. There was 1,200,000,000 passenger pigeons. How many live here today? Gone. There were herds of bison, tatanka, you say buffalo. There were bears, and I'm not talking about guys in shoulder pads and helmets in Chicago. There was game beyond counting. But as more and more Europeans came, game grew more and more scarce. And our family, we just denied our Indian heritage. There are lots of immigrants come to this country, and so we just tried to blend in. Didn't speak much English at first, but eventually learned. I remember that April day. It was 1832. And I was north of Peoria, Illinois, up near Galena in the lead mines. I'd been tracking this huge buck. I could tell from the hoof prints in the mud, this was a giant deer. I came to the top of a hill late in the day, and down in the valley, I saw this buck. I took careful aim, and kablam! Ha-ha! He went down. But he got right back up again. I ran down in the valley, and I could tell from the pool of blood the buck stopped here. But he got right back up again. And so I followed the trail of blood, and I could tell he didn't get far. When I got to the top of the next hill, down in the next valley, in the midst of the prairie, I saw a little copse of woods, an oak grove. And it appeared the deer was heading there. So I followed it. And when I came into this grove of oak trees, I saw Black Hawk, Makatai Mishi Kyuk Kyuk, and his band of warriors. And they were eating my deer. Of course, there were more of them, and they were better armed, and they looked hungrier than I was. But before I could complain, before I could say anything, they invited me to join in the feast. As we butchered that deer and roasted the meat over the fire, one of the young men stepped forward with a drum, and he sang a song of thanksgiving to give honor to the spirit of the deer. Ba-e-ho-ye-ne, ba-e-ho-ye-ne, Shopenta-ho-ye-ne, Shopenta-ho-ye-ne. What does that mean? Native deer, come join the feast. Black-nosed deer, come join the feast. Or maybe it means come be the feast. We feasted. But by the time we were done butchering, roasting, and eating that deer, the sun was going down. It was getting too dark, too late for me to find my way home. Again, before I could say anything, before I could complain, they must have seen the look on my face. They invited me to make camp with them, to spend the night. So as I settled in for a long night around the campfire, I turned to Black Hawk, Makatai Mishikyak, who would have been 67 on this April evening in the 1830s. I asked him to tell me about his life, to tell me his story. He began with the beginning of the universe. The Gitche Manatu, the maker of us all, made the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, and all the creatures thereupon. But in the beginning time, the world was covered with water. And it was Grandma Turtle who swam to the bottom of the ocean and brought up a small ball of mud. And that mud was turned into an island for all of us to rest upon. Turtle Island. Grandma Turtle taught us that all life gives to life. And that is how life is to be lived. Amgua, 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 amgua. Next, an old woman stepped forward, and she told the story about the spring peepers. In the beginning, when the world was new, there were some things left undone. When the first winter came and the snows began to fly, some of the birds said, I don't like this cold, and I'm going to fly south until it warms up again. Other creatures said, oh, I'm just going to sleep it off, and maybe when I wake up, it'll be warm again. But before that first winter, they gathered in a council circle. Who's going to wake us up? If we don't wake up in time, how will we have our offspring and raise them and teach them what they need to know before the snow begins to blow again? They called a council circle. Because Native people believe, as I believe, and I hope you believe, we all have a good mind when we use it. And when we put our minds together, we come up with the best ideas. So everyone was listened to. Everyone was given that respect. From the edge of the circle, they heard a little voice say, we do it, we do it, we do it. Now Wapiti, the elk, looked down and saw this little green frog and said, little frog, what makes you think you can wake up all the creatures? We do it, we do it, we do it. Well, Badger, who was leading the council that day, Badger said, Little Frog volunteers. Little Frog has this job. And Badger waddled away. Now, some animals went to sleep with some trepidation. What if they did not wake up in time? In the spring? But as soon as the snow stopped blowing, as soon as the ice in the river began to melt, as soon as the snow began to melt and the creeks began to rise, from the edge of the pond, from the wetlands, they heard that little voice. We do it, we do it, we do it. Now first it was just one little tiny voice, like a little chime in the morning. And then other voices joined in. Can you join in? We do it, we do it, we do it. And then there were more voices. We do it, we do it. It got louder and louder. We do it, we do it. Have you heard the spring peepers? They can be deafening. So amazing because they are the tiniest little frog. And one by itself you may not hear. But when the whole swamp sings together, they cannot fail. And so it was. And so it is still to this day. Amgua, 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 amgua. Wait a minute. Do you realize what just happened? I asked Black Hawk to tell me his life story, and he began with the beginning of time. He could not separate his small life from the ongoing life of creation. Like Grandma Turtle, he knew that all life gives to life, and that is how life is to be lived. Like the spring peeper, he knew that his small voice by itself was not enough. But if we all sing together, we shall be heard. But I said, tell me about you, this man sitting before me. And he began to talk about his great-great-great-grandpa, Nanamake, which means thunder. He was a great chief among his people who had a vision that he would go east of sunrise and he would meet someone he had never met before. He listened to his vision. He went to the Atlantic coast. And the moment he arrived, Champlain, the son of the King of France, came sailing in. And Champlain said, I had a vision that told me to go to the New World and I would meet a people who had never met a white man. Now wait a minute. These two men who lived thousands of miles apart had the same vision that brought them to the same place in time. Champlain honored the Namake as a chief, a leader among his people. When he went back to his campground, they were selecting a new chief. And in that moment, a bolt of lightning struck the tallest tree and it burst into flame. His name, Nanamake, means thunder. He grabbed a burning stick and lit the council fire and was a great chief. But as more Europeans came to the Atlantic coast, the tribes of the east were forced to the west. And the Sauk Nation moved from the Atlantic coast to northern Michigan. Have you heard of Saginaw, Michigan? Sauconnock, place of the Sauk. But they didn't get along very well with the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa. And so they moved to the west coast of Lake Michigan, where they fell in with the Fox Nation, the Meskwaki. And the two became one nation, but they didn't get along well with the Winnebago. So they moved up the Fox River and down the Wisconsin River, and eventually to the Mississippi, to Rock Island, where Black Hawk was born. Mauna wankantunki jida, Mauna wankantunki jida, earth maker, holy shall I be, holy. Black Hawk said he was born in the spring at Rock Island. And he didn't remember much of his early life, planting corn with his grandmothers, attending the cornfield, playing scarecrow, fishing with his uncles in the Mississippi, the great father of waters. It wasn't until he was 15 that he was allowed to paint and go to war against the Osage, who'd invaded their territory. For you see, as the tribes of the east were forced to the west, tribes that used to live peacefully together were now forced into each other's homes. Black Hawk said his father was the first to volunteer. And so he looked at his father pleadingly, and his father gave his approval. They crossed the Mississippi into the Osage territory. His father led the charge, scalped the enemy, and raised it up with a shriek. Black Hawk raced forward, and he smote his enemy, knocked him to the ground, removed his scalp, and raised it up, looking at his father. His father smiled approvingly. Black Hawk said he took many more scalps and many more battles, but only fought when he felt his village was in danger in defense of his people. Now, I was feeling uncomfortable with this talk of war and wanted to change the subject, so I asked about scalping. Is this a tradition among your people? Among the Tsalagi, it is not something that we did. A young woman stepped forward, and she said, this is actually something started by a British general known as the hair buyer. In the same way that they bought otter pelts and beaver pelts, they would pay for human pelts when they hired our warriors as mercenaries in battle. In the French and Indian War, who were the French really fighting? The British. The wars of the Old World followed them to the New World, and both sides hired Indians as mercenaries. And white soldiers frequently took a trophy, an ear, a nose, put them on strings. She said, you treat the dead with less respect than I would treat my dog. For us, counting coup, getting right up in someone's face and touching them with your coup stick, that takes more courage than shooting at an anonymous enemy from behind the palisade of one of your forts. Again, I'm getting uncomfortable with this talk of fighting. So I turn to this young woman. I say, excuse me, ma'am, you don't look much like a warrior. What are you doing here? She turned and said, I could say the same thing about you, but I won't. She said, you do not understand our people. We are matrilineal. The women are in charge in a time of peace. And a woman can choose to be a warrior, just as a man can choose to stay home and raise the children and tend the crops. And they are not shamed for this. They are seen as more balanced in the masculine and feminine. Their honor is sacred when they make this choice you would say is opposite. I, again, was getting uncomfortable with this conversation and where it was going. So I turned to Black Hawk and I asked what I knew would be a very difficult question. I said, why did you come back? I've seen the treaties signed by your brother Keokuk. This land is no longer yours. Why are you here? He scoffed. And as if he was speaking to a child, he said, I have come home to plant corn. How can you sell the earth, the sky? I did not sign that treaty. And my brother Keokuk, he did not know what his mark meant. And yes, there was probably some fire water, some alcohol involved. How can you sell the earth? He said, look at us. We are not a band of warriors. As I looked around the forest, I saw maybe 100, 200 warriors. But of the 300 people, most of them were elders, women, and children. This was not a war party. He said, I've come home to plant corn, to feed my people. And with that, a young man stepped forward with a drum, and he sang a corn planting song. Kiwajine o e o, kiwajine o, kiwajine. Kiwajine o e o, kiwajine o, kiwajine. I felt with that last question that maybe I had crossed a line. And so I decided to call it a night. I crawled off into the edge of the forest and I went to sleep. It had been a long night. And when I woke up in the morning, I was alone. Was it a dream? Like the mist that disappears at sunrise, Black Hawk and his band of warriors were gone. How could we know that his choice to come home and plant corn would bring the full wrath of the United States military, that storm clouds were gathering in Washington? How could he know that his choice to come home, to plant corn, to feed his people, meant that militia were being organized in 5 states, and 5 future governors would join in the slaughter? 3 future presidents, including President Zachary Taylor, who led the charge, and President Abraham Lincoln fought alongside the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. But in Lincoln's defense, he said, and I quote, I lost a lot of blood in the Black Hawk campaign, mostly to mosquitoes. He organized troops down in New Salem, and by the time they marched to Galena, he missed most of the battle. But one night, an old Indian came stumbling into his camp, and Lincoln's young friends, they wanted to kill an Indian. But Lincoln put himself in harm's way and said, no, this old man is lost. Why would he come to our camp? He means us no harm. In the midst of war, Lincoln practices the supreme act of compassion. You know the good book, Romans, it says feed your enemy. Maybe if we fed our enemy, we'd have fewer enemies. Eventually, Black Hawk and his band were chased to the Mississippi River at a place called Bad Axe. 5,000 soldiers. Put yourself in their shoes. Would you fight or flight? Some chose to swim across the Mississippi in the midst of this. Would you make that choice? Put yourself in their moccasins. A steamboat came down the river to rescue them. No, like shooting fish in a barrel. They massacred women and children. But Black Hawk was caught and taken as a prisoner of war. He was a prize. And taken to Jefferson Barracks on the south side of St. Louis. When I heard what happened, I jumped in my canoe and I flew down the river. I met with William Clark, then the governor of the Missouri Territory, and I got permission to spend time with him to collect these stories. We published a book, Black Hawk's Autobiography. There's much in this book left out of your history book. And my elders have sent me here to tell you this story because in the prophecies of the coming of the European, it was foretold. But they also said that if the Europeans came speaking truth, seeking truth, there'd be a great flowering between nations. But if they came speaking with a forked tongue, we would lie as if dead for 200 years before we'd rise up. How long has it been since the War of 1812? Just over 200 years. It is that time. I would like to believe, if the ancient prophecies are true, that now is that time. When we are rising up, we are standing up at Standing Rock. We shall persist. We have learned that life is better when all life gives to life. And like the spring peepers, when we raise our voice together, we shall be heard. More American Indian women have been elected to Congress than any other election in American history. We shall be heard. If we take the time to listen one to another, this could be that time. What is your story? Who are your ancestors? Where did they come from? I wish I had time to hear those stories. You have heard mine, and you honor me with the quality of your listening. Take the time, please, to listen one to another. And now could be that time of the great flowering of nations. Yana, 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 yana. You can do this. It's really not that hard. First, pick a character where you feel comfortable in their skin. I love Abraham Lincoln, but I'm not tall enough. So I play several friends of Lincoln. One of my favorite is Billy Herndon, his law partner. So if you can, read what they wrote. And then read for context. Think about not just Lincoln's Herndon, but Herndon's Lincoln. And make those connections. I also love to read about the time period. So Life on the Eighth Circuit, this is one of my favorite books. And of course, you could read one of my books. I've written several as various friends of Lincoln. And then once you've read, you don't have to tell their whole life story. Just one or two really pivotal moments in their life. And then think about costuming. I collect hats. And depending on who I'm portraying, I will have a different hat for that character. Because the hats really help the character to come to life. Practice, practice, practice. And then send me a film of what you have recorded, of your favorite historical character. And we might use it on the next episode of History in Person.